You're good, go ahead.
Am I good? Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Morgan Sjogren. I'm really excited to give this talk to a room full of guides. You are who this was made for. Little background, I guess I'll just call myself a writer and wanderer of the public lands in southern Utah, ranging from Grand Staircase, Glen Canyon, and Bears Ears. And I do lots of writing about the public lands issues today and in the past, which is what we're gonna talk about. We're gonna do some time traveling, and we're even gonna go down Hole in the Rock Road before it was called a road. All right, cue it.
Oops, sorry.
It's okay, there might be some slow things like that.
Again?
All right, so we're gonna time travel 100 years ago, essentially. A man named Charles L. Bernheimer, who was a wealthy businessman in Manhattan, decided he wanted to live out his childhood dream and go on an adventure in the Wild West. Bernheimer grew up in Germany and came to New York when he was in his teens, and his family owned a very fabulous textile business. And so he had the means to travel to Utah, and he hired guides to do it. So his first trip ever was to Rainbow Bridge by Navajo Mountain or Paiute Mountain or Toconavi, depending on who you're talking to. And he was totally smitten. And his first guide was Zeke Johnson, who's from Kanab. And so Bernheimer was like, I've got to come back. And so he rounded up a team of all the best local guides and started creating these expeditions on behalf of the American Museum of Natural History. He wanted to do more with his travels than be a sightseeing tourist.
It's on a timer, so just...
Oh, let's just leave it on then. So he wanted to be more than a sightseeing tourist, even after one visit, like something switched. And what his goal was, and also he was a writer, so he would write about his travels for the New York Times, and he even wrote a book about it. He wanted to instill a love for nature even in its bleakest and sternest mood, where the conventional exhibits of beauty are not found, but where beauty, if the traveler wishes to see, exists in fullest measure, and to urge upon others to do as I have done. We'll get to what that means later. So, about his guiding outfit. So he hired John Wetherill, who was from Mancos, Colorado, but later became based in the Navajo Mountain area, Zeke Johnson, Zeke, Earl Morris, who was an archaeologist for the American Museum based in New Mexico, and then a sort of rotating cast of Diné and Paiute guides as well. So this is a photo of one of his crews. And the expeditions took place every summer, almost every year for a decade, between 1919 and 1930. And these were month-long pack trips in the backcountry, primarily in Glen Canyon, but also on the Navajo Nation, Monument Valley, Canyon del Muerto, and present-day Bears Ears National Monument. These trips continued, and by 1929, Bernheimer had dreamt up his perfect route, and it was a 350-mile tour of Glen Canyon. This was the heart of the places he had traveled for the past decade, and many people told him the route was going to be way too complicated, but he persisted, and him and his team came up with this awesome route. Where do I come in with all of this? I was also very intrigued by his route, but he didn't leave a map. He just kind of kept these journal entries and photos, and so I wondered, could I figure out where Bernheimer went? And this was not simply to just follow some ghost around the desert. Because his notes were so descriptive, they also give us a 100-year context of how much the landscape has changed. So by piecing it together, I could also see like, wow, their horses had a lot of trouble getting through here, and now it's a road or a highway. Or, oh, that river that they forded is now a reservoir. What was also going through Bernheimer's mind for this Glen Canyon trip is that in 1916, a man named E.C. LaRue was hired to go on a fabulous adventure down the Colorado River looking for dam locations. And by 1922, the United States had created this law of the river to start managing the Colorado River for 7 states. And in LaRue's proposal was a dam in Glen Canyon, slightly off of the present site, but not too far. Bernheimer, being on the East Coast, was very privy to what was going on in the bureaucratic level, was very concerned because if there was a dam in Glen Canyon, it would flood specifically Rainbow Bridge. And he said this absolutely cannot be happening. So part of his 1929 trip with the guides was a planning meeting. Obviously, Hoover Dam, this was all sparked by the Boulder Canyon Project Act of 1928. The next year, 1929, was the Glen Canyon planning meeting on the expedition. And so they came up with this idea, Bernheimer and his guides, to propose a national park in Glen Canyon. And so this is the original map. It's on very thin paper, and it's very hard to see in real life and on this screen. And it essentially encompasses the south side of Glen Canyon on the Navajo Nation today and into Monument Valley and near the San Juan. And so this was their proposal. They said if it's a national park, they can't put dams up. Later, we know what happened. But so this was the initial vision. Bernheimer would go to DC and he would meet with, today's version of the Park Service and Congress. John Wetherill took dignitaries and people interested in this on river trips up Glen Canyon so they could see its beauty. And there were meetings held both in Utah and in DC. This is John Wetherill on one of his famous up Glen Canyon river trip in winter, which he used to take photos for publicity for why this should be a national park. And it's just incredibly badass. Back here, that's all ice in the Colorado River. No, that's great. Okay, so as this gets going, the park proposal expands by 1931 to include what is today Bears Ears National Monument. So all the way up near natural bridges, past the San Juan goosenecks, and beyond. But it still includes parts of the Navajo Nation, which becomes a sticky situation. In part because the Navajo Nation doesn't necessarily trust, for good reason, that this is going to work out well for them. Bernheimer's proposal was pretty forward-thinking in that he put in the document that the park will not displace anybody from their home. Everyone is allowed to live and work and continue their livelihood, but there's no new development. So very similar to the National Monument proposals today. Old uses are grandfathered in, new dams, no thank you. The other issue that is too much for this conversation is that there was also sort of a land, the San Juan Southern Paiute reservation lands were in the process of being taken into the Navajo Nation, which created a lot of tension and a lot of confusion and a double management snafu for those parklands that he included in the proposal. By expanding it to the present-day Bears Ears areas, it gave the idea a little bit more like ground because it avoided those areas. Next slide. So this is Dave Holliday, one of Bernheimer's Diné guides. And he, okay, next slide. I'm jumping over him. Okay, so by 1937, this proposal, in fact, was part of the evolution of the 1937 Escalante National Monument proposal. How many of you are familiar with this? Okay, a few of you. So the current Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument was designated in 1996, but this idea came out in 1936. And over the span between 1931 and 36, they recruited young men to go out and explore these areas and help create the groundwork for a much larger monument that actually would include it would even include the confluence of the Colorado and Green River and Canyonlands National Park. It mirrors a lot of, if you're familiar with the Red Rock Wilderness Act that's being proposed, a lot of those landscapes are included in there. So this would be like Bears Ears, Glen Canyon, Canyonlands, and Grand Staircase and Capitol Reef combined. mind. There was pushback from some local community members about limitations to grazing. This also happened at the same time as the Taylor Grazing Act, which was implemented to prevent overgrazing, which was causing major problems for the ranchers themselves. So again, difficult timing, lots of tension, maybe not unlike today, just in a little different form, and a lot of this laid the groundwork for good things that have happened today, and also some of it feels like, where have we gotten? Unfortunately, despite this proposal looking promising, it got shut down during World War II and was not revisited until many decades later. And also the other bad news, we all know about the dam in Page, which did flood the reservoir, but all of that is to say what has happened in the last few decades is so beautiful and promising. The formation of Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument and Bears Ears National Monument were not new ideas in the past few years and decades. They are finally the fulfillment of an idea that people have had for long before we all got on the scene to protect these irreplaceable landscapes. And so now what? So Bernheimer called his team of guides the rough and ready soul corral because they were all really diverse. They all had different religious backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, but they all came together. You can see them here pulling a horse out of the Colorado River as they were mucking around in 1929. They came together with this vision to protect an area that they all loved, whether it was their homelands or whether they came as a visitor like Bernheimer. And beyond the national park proposal, it really shows the impact that guides have on visitors from distant places, be it New York or another country, not only to share your love of the land, but also educate them about the realities of protections and how vital they are to have an experience like you're giving your clients. And you know, that's something that can extend beyond politics because the very act of walking on that land is made possible by something like the management plan. And so you all are part of the rough and ready soul corral. Unfortunately, I did take out the slides. I had some great pictures of the old Hole in the Rock Road. Actually, this is sort of it, but it's tiny. So his expedition took place between the San Juan and Colorado River confluence, which is the other side of Hole in the Rock. Many visitors might not realize that when they drive down Hole in the Rock Road to the big blast point where they took the LDS families, took their covered wagons down the Hole in the Rock Road, and then crossed the Colorado River. They continued on the other side, and they continued to build and blast the road through incredibly difficult terrain, even steeper passages than the Hole in the Rock in some places. And much of Bernheimer's route also followed this, and so I was able to hike on it, and it was incredible in places to see the wagon tracks and the blast marks from where this feat of engineering. I mean, there was several feet of snow when the Hole in the Rock expedition passed through in the 1860s. Nobody died. 2 children were born. You know, it was quite the expedition. And so something I like to think about or present when people are talking about the Hole in the Rock issue is that, I mean, the dirt road on the Escalante side is pretty cush compared to the conditions that the Hole in the Rock families faced and persisted in. And the other side is much more reminiscent of that. But when you drive those 50 plus miles of bumps and ruts, it makes you remember that history and makes you grateful that for you, this is a hiking adventure. And for them, this was, we don't know what's gonna happen next. So thanks for being here. If you have any questions, I can answer them. And I do have I'm not here to sell books, but I do have a couple copies of my book, Path of Light, which gets way more into the nitty-gritty details of this adventure.
Any questions? You were able to go out and kind of actually map it. Did you end up creating your own map of his path? I do have my own map. It's a crazy map. But yeah, I have one. I keep it for myself. The book does not share the map. It shares the terrain. For me, what was most important was making those touch points on change in the last 100 years because
There were some very beautiful parts about his route. It's definitely not something most people want to do. There were definitely like weeks, because it was 330 miles, and I was out for 40 days, and like there were a few like 7-day stretches where I was like, what am I doing here? Like, I'm gonna die out here and no one's gonna know where I am because nobody hikes here. Yeah.
Did any cross the Escalante Dominguez route? Any part of the scene?
So Bernheimer had several different routes that he did over the decade, and some of them did cross or go to the crossing of the Fathers on the Navajo Nation, but not the 1929 route. And I have retraced big portions of those other ones as well, but unfortunately crossing of the Fathers is under the reservoir for now.
How long did it take you to map out your route? You said it took you 40 days to do it, and what was the inspiration that made you like, wow, I want to go on this adventure? Yeah.
Good question. So mapping the route in some ways was the culmination of several years following his routes around Rainbow Bridge and other areas of the Navajo Nation. But the 1929 route, I mean, even just finding the expedition journals took a period of time. But specifically, I spent between like December of 2020 and February of 2021 mapping the route with the help of Steve Allen, canyoneer, guidebook extraordinaire, and Harvey Leek, who was the great-grandson of John Wetherill, putting maps in an entire room and reading the journals line by line and combining our knowledge of on-the-ground information to figure it out. I didn't get to include this in the book. I did later, digging through the American Museum of Natural History archives, find the actual map. It does exist. And I did get the route right. We did have to make some changes because of highways and reservoir. And then your other question, what inspired me to do this? It's a very long story, but in short, I was living in Bears Ears National Monument in my Jeep in the winter, and I had a stack of old history books that I would read to keep me company until it was warm enough to get out of my Jeep. And I was often frozen inside because of the mud. It was intense. And Bernheimer's book was one of them. At the same time, I had an email from archaeologist Bill Leip, a conversation with author David Roberts, and a fireside chat with my friend and archaeologist Ari Barillo, and all three suggested in like a 2-week span, have you ever thought about retracing the Bernheimer expeditions? Which was a crazy question because I had. And so after 3 people asked me, I said, this is what I need to do, and that's what I did.
Do you know how Bernheimer or the others crossed the Colorado River?
I'm trying to think about the context of your question. Like for the 1929 route?
Yeah, or the Whole Rock expedition. Like,
Yeah.
Did they make a boat? Did they
No.
shallow enough that they could get across?
I think in the Hole in the Rock, and don't quote me on this, there may have been a ferry that they used, like a flotilla of logs. For the Bernheimer expedition, they actually hiked downstream on the side of the banks and then went so they could look in the tributary canyons of Glen Canyon. So that gives us a little bit of important context of what the shorelines of Glen Canyon were like in the 1920s. John Wetherill called it Willerin because you'd grab the willows and kind of just whack your way downstream. And so, yeah, they weren't actually, on that expedition, they never crossed the river. They moved alongside it. And that picture of the horse bogged down in the mud, you know, they called it endless troubles. And because I am not able to do that, and neither of you, I retraced the rims of those canyons, which was incredibly slow moving terrain and lack of water. So I still got that sense of like endless troubles.
Where did a lot of your photos come from? Did you have to go to National Archives? Were you good to do that research?
Yeah, so fortunately I fell in with this crew of, they call themselves the Filthy Five and added me as the Silty Six. This old gang of historians and hikers who have been obsessed with the Bernheimer expeditions, and they actually found me and said, what? You're one of us. And they had collected photos, especially Harvey Leek, whose great-grandfather was on the expedition, and so he has many of those copies. Later, I was able to go to the American Museum and see Bernheimer made these gorgeous photo books with hundreds of photos and captions, and they're held there in perpetuity. But yeah, when it comes down to questions about the CRA or public lands or the monuments right now, I think it's really important to think about the historical context that we are all a part of and that we're helping to preserve and help realize this idea of, I mean, much was lost in the last 100 years before the monument protections, and so these are also to keep in check future damages to these landscapes.
So has this inspired another project? Do you have something else in mind, or something, a break off of this, or a totally different project?
It's related. I was spending so much of my time pretty much like living above Lake Powell Reservoir and became quite obsessed with the reservoir, but more so the rivers feeding into it. And so I'm working on a book about the Colorado River watershed and really exploring who are the citizens and the communities, both human and wildlife, that we share this space of very dwindling water with. And that is going to be coming out with Torrey House Press next year. So if any of you have any particular knowledge or anyone that you think I should talk to about this, because it includes guides. Many of you are making your livelihoods taking clients to experience these tributaries. And Grand Staircase is the Escalante and Paiute tributaries for the Colorado. They're both very important. So I'm all ears and would love to talk to you.